All right, so it looks like from now on I'm going to have to be doing videos this way, where I record them from a separate source and then upload them, since I can no longer record directly into Canvas. So I apologize for my video being late. That's part of the reason it's late. I've been really working on this, trying to figure out how I can get it to work. So anyway, we're into the unit now where we're getting on the establishment of the colonial order and the settlement of Latin America. So you have two chapters in this unit. The first one focuses really on the administrative aspects or the political aspects of all of this. So it talks about the political structure, how it was top down from Spain, and then kind of the way it worked in the Americas. And you'll see how at first, they had these grand ideas of, this single viceroy who would do things, and then they realized they had this massive amount of land that not only had to be divided into different viceroyalties, but even further divided into audiencias or governorships and then into regional areas, because otherwise it was beyond control, right? And even the idea that they had initially that everybody who is in a top administrative position should come from Spain or should come from areas other than they were administering, mainly because they didn't want these officials to have loyalty, right, to the areas where they went to. They wanted their loyalty to be with Spain. But even that didn't always work because, first of all, once there wasn't a whole lot of land or labor to divide up anymore, not a whole lot of people wanted to go from Spain, right? And second of all, because people began to develop loyalty and to be looking out for their interests or the interests of the area in which they were moving to. So the chapter 3 deals mainly with this administrative structure, and then it gets into the church. And this is really interesting because the church and state relationship was extremely significant, at least in the very early colonial period. Some of the administrative matters had to be approved by the patronato, or the patronage from the church. So even in matters of state, the government didn't always have the top say on everything. The church also was extremely significant in establishing education and in making sure that people were good Catholics, right? That if they were converted, that they were being true to the Catholic faith. So they brought the Inquisition. I mean, you'll read about some of that with your documents that you're reading this time around as well. The church was divided as well, just like the government was kind of divided. You had the secular clergy and the regular clergy. Now, secular clergy were ones that were tied to the overall church structure. They set up parishes. They controlled the regular churches. Regular clergy were the religious orders. So you had the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Jesuits who came later, who were a little bit more outside of crown control because they were tied more directly to Rome and to the Pope. So that's the major part of chapter 3. In chapter 4, then, we get into labor and labor structures. It talks a little bit also about society and social classes, but we'll get into that more deeply in the next unit. So when it talks about society, it's talking about it in terms of labor. And so initially the thought was, oh, hey, we've got Indian labor, right? Millions, literally. But then they're dying off because they have no resistance to disease, or they're being moved around, or they're losing land and they don't have access to their traditional agriculture. And then also they became protected. There was laws instituted that said, hey, you can't use these guys in slavery. So and this was mainly because the church decided that these people had what was called a tabula rasa, or a clean slate. They'd never been exposed to Christianity, and so therefore they were like children, and you couldn't treat them as slaves. So this is where they got the idea, okay, well, we're going to start importing African slaves. And this was particularly beneficial for the Portuguese because the Portuguese in this early time period controlled the slave trade. So it's more beneficial for them to bring in African slaves who they felt were more accustomed to labor, which is weird because they weren't from that area. Um, but they were more accustomed to Europeans and to European ideas, and so they thought this would be the way to handle it. Um, Indians worked in primarily what were called encomiendas in the early period. Now, encomiendas were supposed to be just grants of Indian labor. The Indians still controlled their land, but they had to work the land for a conquistador. So technically, he didn't own the land. The Indians still controlled the land, and they had to turn over tribute or taxes um, to these conquistadors or settlers, right? So as encomiendas started to, well, as Indians started to not be as abundant anymore and couldn't be handed out in encomiendas, the crown did away with this. But that didn't mean there wasn't unfree labor of the indigenous people, right? Because they did. They worked then in repartimientos. Repartimientos were when each town or area had to give up a certain number of workers or hours of workers, and then you could petition. They initially was set up, repartimiento or mita was set up initially for things like road building projects or town building projects, but then later they could be requested, particularly by mines. And then as people started to consolidate land and create haciendas or large farms, they could be requested for that. And that would eventually then transition into debt peonage, where Indians were enticed by granting of money or of favors. And so they were enticed to come and work the land, and then they would end up being tied to a certain property by debt. They could never repay what they had been loaned in the beginning. The landowners made sure it was kept out of their reach to be able to pay this back. And honestly, this system of debt peonage still goes on in parts of Latin America today. And it has existed since the colonial system. All right, so for this unit, you have your 2 chapters in your colonial Latin America textbook. You also have a couple of chapters or documents in the colonial lives. The quizzes are over the colonial Latin America text, okay? This will start to change. I'll start to incorporate some of the documents in the quizzes, but for now, we're just keeping it to the colonial Latin America book. But you are required to make reference to information from the documents in writing your discussion posts. So that's about where we're at. Also, please don't forget, I did open also the research project module. And so you have to propose what you want to do your research project on. So take some time. I gave some suggestions for what you might think about doing, but you don't have to use those suggestions. There are tons of ideas for the colonial period. But make sure you submit that because you get points just for submitting what you want to do for your project. And remember, if you are taking S290, so the Spanish culture section of this course, you have to do a PowerPoint research project. If you are an F341, which is the 300 level history, you are writing a research paper. The research is the same, the work is the same, all that's different is the final project. So if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Hasta luego.